Alright guys, we are going to flip our classroom again, just like we did for last unit. So you're going to watch this video at home, and we're going to do activities in class. And today we are going to be talking about President Nixon's tenure in office and the craziness that was the 1970s. So as we know, as we've learned from last chapter, President Nixon was elected in 1968. He won because of George Wallace. He split the Republican vote down south. The Democratic vote down south, because the Democrats were still Southern during this time period. And it was split between him and George Wallace. He ends up winning the election. And he and Henry Kissinger, as we talked about in last chapter, did end America's involvement in Vietnam. Besides ending Americans' involvement in Vietnam, he also wanted to cut down the government, because remember, the Great Society and President Johnson had made it really, really big, and he wanted to make government smaller. So that was his other goal besides ending America's involvement in Vietnam. We talk about domestic policies of certain presidents. Nixon's domestic policy was called New Federalism, and its purpose was to cut the government down. As you guys remember, the Great Society, programs like Job Corps, Vista, HUD, all of these programs made the federal government have to pay a lot more money out. So with New Federalism, he wanted to give that money back to the states and let the states decide what they want to spend programs on. So everything I'm highlighting, just like when we do notes in class, everything I'm highlighting you should have on your notes at home. So the things I'm highlighting, make sure they put in your notes. Okay? Revenue sharing. Revenue sharing is how the president would get the power back to the states. Revenue sharing, the federal government would give the state governments lots and lots of money. And then the state governments would decide how they would spend that money. They would spend it on welfare. They would spend it on Medicare and Medicaid, which were the two of the programs that were a part of the Great Society. So the states would figure out how they would spend the money that the federal government gave. And then the other ones that he didn't like, the programs that Johnson had created in the Great Society that Nixon didn't like, he decides that he just would not give money to those programs. He tried to overhaul welfare with something called FAP. FAP was a program, welfare, food stamps and all that stuff was created by Johnson. FAP would give money to any family of four, $1,600. And if they needed supplemental income, they'd give up to $4,000. With FAP, they would have to go to community colleges. They would have to take any type of job training and accept any type of job that was given to them. But it failed the Senate, because the Senate was mostly Democrat, and so it failed to pass. To make the federal government smaller, Nixon started to try to dismantle programs that Johnson had created that we talked about in the Great Society, like Job Corps and HUD. He also tried to do away with the OEO, and he did this by pretty much trying to get rid of the programs, by not paying for those programs. And the Supreme Court said that that was unconstitutional. That was known as impounding, just not paying programs that you didn't like. However, it's unconstitutional because those were laws, and laws have to be federally funded if they are laws. Nixon does increase spending on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid to try to get some of the things in his New Federalism program backed by both houses of Congress, however. Nixon. You guys probably know that Nixon was kind of shady. He was a shady dude. He used a lot of things to get his way. And the first thing that he used a lot of was actually the FBI. People that he did not like, he would get the FBI to investigate them. He would wiretap people's phones. He even wiretapped the Democratic Party's phones in Watergate. If you guys remember from Forrest Gump, if you didn't know, we are watching that movie in this class. So if you remember from Forrest Gump, Forrest is in a hotel and he calls on the phone. He sees flashlights and he calls on the phone and he says, "Guys, there's something hiding in this hotel." And it was it's called CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, and that was a part of Nixon's Law and Order program that he used the FBI to carry out. He also used the CIA and the IRS. So if you were his political rival, or if you were a leftist, you were in the anti-war movement, or any of the other movements that we actually have discussed in class, then he would actually use the IRS to audit your tax returns. So trying to get you to stop doing what you were doing. 1962, Nixon goes up for re-election. 1972, excuse me. Nixon goes up for re-election. And the way that he wins the election of 1972 is actually to use something called the Southern Strategy. As we've known throughout American history, after the Civil War, the Southern states voted Democrat because the Democrats were the party of the South. They were the party of slavery. They were the party that Southerns identified with to keep segregation going. Starting with FDR, that policy starts to change, and then Truman, he desegregates the armed forces, and then you have Kennedy, who tries to do more with civil rights, and then finally you have Johnson, who passes all those civil rights legislation during the civil rights movement. So by 1972, many Southerners were getting angry at the Democratic Party, and so they were starting to switch to the Republican Party, and this switch takes place completely in 1972, when Nixon starts using his Southern Strategy. In his Southern Strategy, he appealed to the consciousness of Southerners, saying, "Yeah, guys, this segregation stuff, we're doing it too fast. Maybe we should change it. Maybe we should get rid of it. Maybe we should, yes, integrate, but let's slow it down a little bit." Nixon tries to slow down integration and desegregation in the South. The Supreme Court said that he could not do that because of Brown versus Board of Education and Brown 2. The Supreme Court also had a court case in 1970. As I told you guys earlier on when we started talking about the Civil Rights Movement, North Carolina, schools in North Carolina did not integrate until the 1970s. And one of the first school districts in North Carolina to integrate was actually Charlotte Mecklenburg. And they used busing to integrate their schools. And I'm not talking about just getting on a yellow bus, blah, blah, blah. I'm talking about they would actually go, they didn't have neighborhood schools like we have here in Wakefield, where if you live in this community, you go to this school. They actually bused students. And we actually still use busing here in Wake County. They do not use it anymore in Charlotte. So in order to make sure that there were a certain amount of minorities in each school, they would bus minorities from certain areas of Charlotte to the white areas to make sure that schools were integrated. And they did this. Swan said that that was unconstitutional, so they actually sued the city and the county. They lost. The Supreme Court said that busing could be used to integrate school districts. In 2000, I forgot the court case, but it was Charlotte again. Another parent sued the Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education. It was either 2000 or 2004. I can't remember which one it was. But they ruled that busing could no longer be used to integrate schools. So districts like Wake County, we still use busing, but we don't use it. We don't say that it's to integrate schools by race. We say that it's to integrate schools by socioeconomic status, and that is how we get around it. But starting next year, if I'm not mistaken, we are stopping our busing in Wake County, and most schools in Wake County will be community schools. This protest right here, you might think that this is actually in the South. It is not. This protest is actually in Boston. Many schools up north, they actually did not want to be integrated. They did not want busing in their cities as well. Starting in the 1970s, the economy that had been running high since Eisenhower's time in office starts to go down. The 1970s themselves, and the early 1980s, are noted as a bad time for our economy in the United States. We enter a period called stagflation, when unemployment is very, very high, and there's also high inflation. Those are two really bad things. People can't find work, and people can't buy things that they used to buy because the price of everything goes up. That's what inflation is. Oil was one of the things that really went up. If you look online, look at different pictures, look at YouTube, during the 1970s, you will see lines of people at the gas tanks trying to get gas. And during the 1970s, they actually had this program that if your license plate ended in a certain number, you couldn't get gas that day. They told you when you could and couldn't get gas because of OPEC. OPEC raised oil prices, so gas prices skyrocketed. If we looked at the gas prices from the 70s and we see that there were 70 cents, we're like, that's not skyrocketing. But just imagine going from a quarter to 79 cents. That's insane. So that's some of the things that were happening in the United States during the 1970s. The OPEC countries, mostly countries in the Middle East, they were actually mad at the United States because we supported Israel, and so they are the ones who are going to raise the oil prices, and these oil prices are going to stay raised during the 1970s. To try to battle stagflation, Nixon raised taxes, which seems odd to me, and he also cut budget. This did not work. Stagflation continues to rise in the 1970s. Foreign policy rise, we've talked about his domestic policy. His foreign policy is very, very important that you know the name of these two things. The first thing is called realpolitik. If you guys remember, we have been talking about containment in class since we talked about the end of World War II. And that was our policy that all our presidents had. Those are the things that led us into Korea, that led us into Vietnam. Realpolitik is a foreign policy that shies away from this brinkmanship, from this containment that we had been doing for 20, 30 years. Realpolitik pretty much said that we really don't care if you're communist. We actually care if you actually have power. So we don't care if Vietnam becomes communist. Vietnam has no power. We need to look at countries that have power, like China, like the Soviet Union. So if a country is weak, we ignore it. If a country is strong, we try to make that country a little bit more of our friend. To go along with realpolitik, the foreign policy of Nixon was détente. Détente was aimed at easing Cold War tensions. Nixon became the first sitting United States president to actually visit China since it had become communist after World War II. And he's also the first sitting president that visits the Soviet Union after it had become communist after World War I. What you probably know most about Nixon, however, is Watergate. Watergate, as just discussed earlier on in these notes, Watergate was a hotel, and the Democrats had their headquarters to re-elect to try to elect their new candidate in the Watergate Hotel. Nixon actually knows about this scandal. They go in, they wiretap the Democratic Convention's phones, try to figure out some of their strategies to try to get their person elected, and they found out about it. The FBI found out that he had wiretapped his phones, and they got in trouble for it. The people who actually did or knew mostly about the wiretapping were his advisors, H.R. Haldeman, John Okerman, John Mitchell, and John Dean. They were known as the President's Men. These are those guys who knew about the wiretapping, and these are some of the political cartoons that we see from the Watergate scandal.